My name is Delia Marchetti. I'm 44 years old. 3 weeks ago, at my little sister's engagement dinner in a restaurant in downtown Roanoke, Virginia, my mother stood up, put her hand on the arm of the groom's father, and said to a table of 60 people, "Oh, don't mind Delia. She pumps gas for a living. We don't really talk about it." The groom's father was a man named Ambrose Okafor. Silver hair, quiet eyes, a gray suit that fit him the way suits fit men who used to wear a different kind of uniform. He had been cutting into a piece of trout when she said it, and I watched his knife stop. I watched him set his fork down on the white tablecloth, slow and deliberate, the way you set something down when you've just decided the next 60 seconds are going to matter more than anything else that happens all night. Then he pushed back his chair, and he stood up, all 6 feet of him, in a room where nobody had asked him to speak. And my mother was still smiling, still holding her wine, still waiting for the polite laughter that always followed one of her little jokes about me. It didn't come, because General Okafor turned, not to her, but to me. And what he did next made my mother's knees actually buckle. She caught herself on the back of a chair. My sister went white before I'd said a single word. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because if I just tell you what he did, you won't feel it. You'll hear it the way you hear a fact. And this was never a fact. This was 10 years of being made small at every table I ever sat at. Finally, in one moment, weighed on a different scale. So let me take you back. Let me tell you who I actually am and who my family decided I was, and why an old man in a gray suit did the thing he did. Before I go on, one small thing. This channel is a kind of roll call for the people who did the work and never got their name read out loud, the ones who held something together quietly while everybody else got the applause. If that's you, or if it's someone you love, subscribe so you don't miss the next name I call. And if you feel like it, put one word in the comments. The job, the duty, the thing you carried that your own family never once thanked you for. I read them. All of them. Now, let me take you back to a gas station on Route 11. There's a place called Troutville, Virginia. You'd miss it if you sneezed on the interstate. It sits just north of Roanoke, off Route 11, which everybody there still calls Lee Highway. And it's the kind of town where the same 40 families have known each other for 100 years. On the corner of Lee Highway and a road called Mill Creek, there's a gas station, 2 pumps, a garage bay, a cooler of drinks, a coffee machine that's older than most of the people who use it. The sign out front says, "Marchetti's Gas and Go." My father built that station in 1979, the year before I was born. He ran it for 42 years, and when he died in the spring of 2021, he left it to me. So yes, my mother wasn't lying exactly. If you drove through Troutville on a Saturday morning, you might see me behind that counter, ringing up a coffee, waving at a truck. You might see me in coveralls, elbow deep in the guts of a tow truck that's been giving me trouble. From the outside, you'd think there's a woman who runs a gas station in a small town, and you would only be seeing about 2% of the truth, because 6 days a week and most weekends of my life, I've been something else. I'm a colonel in the Army National Guard, 22 years in. And that word, colonel, is the whole story my mother spent a decade pretending she couldn't remember. Let me explain how those two things live in the same person, because I know how it sounds. The National Guard isn't the active duty army. Guard officers, guard soldiers. We have civilian lives. Teachers, cops, nurses, mechanics, small business owners. We drill, we train, we deploy when the country calls, and the rest of the time we go to work like everybody else. There are guard colonels who are dentists. There are guard sergeants who drive school buses. So a woman can run her dead father's gas station on Lee Highway and also command hundreds of soldiers. Both of those were me. The town knew the gas station. My mother made very, very sure the town never heard about the rest. I need you to understand my father before you understand anything else. Salvatore Marchetti. Everybody called him Sal. He came up hard, built that. station with his own two hands, and he had exactly one belief he pushed on me my whole life. You are what you do when nobody's clapping. He said it to me when I was 9 and helping him change oil. He said it when I told him at 18 I'd gotten an ROTC scholarship to Virginia Tech, and my mother had cried. Not the proud kind. He said it the last time I saw him conscious, in a hospital bed in Roanoke, 3 days before his heart gave out for good. When he died, the station was drowning. He'd been sick for 2 years and too proud to tell anyone how far behind he'd fallen. There were liens. There was a stack of past due notices in a drawer he'd never opened. Any sensible person would have sold it, taken whatever was left, and walked. I couldn't. It was the only thing on this earth my father made that still had his fingerprints on it. So I did what I do. I made a plan. I put my own money in. I worked the counter on the weekends I wasn't in uniform. I learned the books. And over 3 years, quietly, I pulled Marchetti's Gas and Go out of the red and into the black. Nobody clapped. Nobody was supposed to. That was the whole point. My mother watched me do that and saw only one thing. Her daughter, in coveralls, pumping gas. To her, it confirmed everything she'd decided about me a long time ago. Her name is Corinne. She's 68 now. And to be as fair to her as I can be, I'll tell you where she comes from, because it's the key to all of it. My mother grew up without money and spent her whole adult life terrified of ever looking like she still didn't have any. She married my father when the station was young, and she thought it would make them rich. It didn't. It made them fine, comfortable, small town fine. And fine was, to Corinne, a kind of failure she could never forgive. So she built a different life in her head, a life of doctors and lawyers and daughters who married into important families. And she measured everyone she loved against that invisible ruler. I was her first big disappointment. I was supposed to be the doctor. Instead, at 18, I chose the Army. To my mother, a uniform meant one thing. It meant you couldn't do any better. I'll give you 3 moments because they'll tell you more than any speech. When I was 17, I won the regional science fair with a project on combustion engines. My father's genes, all the way through. My mother didn't come. She had, she told me, a hair appointment she just couldn't move. When I stood up in our kitchen at 18 and told my parents I'd earned a full ROTC scholarship, my father put down his coffee and hugged me so hard he lifted me off the floor. And my mother said into the silence, "Well, I suppose we won't be telling the Hallorans." As if my scholarship were a diagnosis. And in 2002, when I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in a ceremony at Virginia Tech, in the rain, with my father in the second row crying openly and proudly. My mother wasn't there. She'd had, she said, a thing. She never told me what the thing was. I stopped asking years back. Over the years, the pattern just deepened. When I deployed the first time, she told the neighbors I was away for work. When I made major, then lieutenant colonel, then colonel, 3 promotions, 3 of the proudest days of my life. She never once asked what any of it meant. She genuinely, to this day, could not tell you the difference between a sergeant and a general. She never wanted to know, because knowing would have meant it counted. And if it counted, then her whole story about me fell apart. One Thanksgiving, maybe 6 years ago, I made the mistake of mentioning I'd just gotten back from a training rotation, and she waited exactly 4 seconds before turning to the table and asking if anyone had heard about Tessa's promotion at the boutique. 4 seconds. I counted. I always count. My sister Tessa came along 12 years after me. I was practically raising her while my mother worked the front of that boutique in Roanoke, and Tessa was everything I wasn't allowed to be. She was the redo. My mother poured everything into her. Tessa got the right schools, the right friends, the right way to laugh at the right tables. And when Tessa, at 32, got engaged to Bennett Okafor, a man from a family with a real name, real money, a father who'd been a general, my mother finally felt the invisible ruler tip in her favor. There's a rhythm to how she talks about the two of us. I've heard it 1,000 times. At church, at the grocery store in Daleville, at any gathering with more than 4 people. Tessa's marrying into the Okafor family, you know. Pause, warm smile. Then, if my name comes up at all, and Delia, well, Delia's got the gas station. The way you'd mention a distant cousin who had some trouble. She wasn't cruel about it in a way you could point at. That was her genius. It was never an insult you could catch and hold. It was just a quiet, endless subtraction. I stopped fighting it years ago. You cannot argue a person into respecting you. I learned that in uniform, the hard way, and I learned it again at my mother's dinner table. So I became the daughter who sent a card on Mother's Day and never talked about her real work. And everybody in that family was perfectly comfortable with the arrangement. Nobody ever asked me what I actually did out there, not once in 22 years. Not my mother, not my sister. They had a version of me in their heads, and it was easier for everyone if I just matched it. The strange part is, I almost did. Right up until a Friday night in October, I almost let it be enough. The call about the dinner came from Tessa, 3 weeks before it happened. First time she'd called me in about 2 months, and I knew from the first breath it was because she needed something. Delia. So, Bennett's parents want to do an engagement dinner, a real one. His dad's flying his people in and everything. A pause. Mom really wants you there. Mom wants me there, or you want me there. There was a silence on the line that told me more than any answer. It'll look weird if you're not, she finally said. People will ask where my sister is. That was the whole invitation. Not I'd love you there. Not you're my sister, and this matters. Just, it will look weird. I almost said no. I had a drill weekend I could have hidden behind, and God knows nobody at that table would have missed me. But then Tessa said one more thing, quieter, and it was the thing that got me. Bennett's dad asked about you. He asked if I had any brothers or sisters, and Mom said, and I quote, "Oh, just Delia, she keeps to herself." And Bennett's dad kind of looked at her funny. I don't know, can you come? Please? I told her I'd come. I don't fully know why. Maybe because for 1 second she'd sounded like the little girl I used to carry on my hip. Maybe because I was tired of being the ghost in my own family's story. That night, I called the one person on earth who actually knows me. His name is Ruben Salcedo. He was my platoon sergeant on that first deployment, the one who was laying down fire the day everything went wrong. And he's been my closest friend for 13 years. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear a ball game on behind him. "You're overthinking it," he said before I'd even finished. "You always do the same thing, Colonel. You go into these family things planning to disappear, and then you disappear, and then you call me and you're mad about it." "I'm not going to disappear." He laughed, not unkindly. "You've said that before. This time I mean it. I'm just going to go and be myself, and if somebody asks what I do, I'm going to tell them the truth for once." There was a pause. "Good," Ruben said, and he wasn't laughing anymore. "It's about time somebody at that table found out who they've been sitting next to." I hung up, and I looked at the photo of my father I keep on the shelf next to the register, and I thought about his one belief: you are what you do when nobody's clapping. And I thought, just once, I'd like to sit at a table with these people as myself. I didn't plan anything. I want to be very clear about that, because of what people always assume. I didn't know who was going to be in that room. I didn't know the name Okafor meant what it meant. Tessa had never once said her fiancé's father was anyone in particular, just his dad's retired military. In my family, retired military was a phrase my mother used the way you'd say, he had a job with the government. Vague, beneath detail. I had no idea. I want you to hold on to that because it makes what happened next so much heavier. I walked into that room completely blind. The dinner was on Friday, October 11th, at a place called The Blackthorn on Jefferson Street in downtown Roanoke. Farm-to-table, exposed brick, the kind of restaurant that puts a single scallop on a big white plate and charges you $38 for it. The Okafors had booked the private room in the back. Long table. 60 people. Bennett's family flying in from Atlanta and Washington and somewhere in Georgia I didn't catch. I drove down from Troutville in my truck, a 2016 Silverado, clean but not new, 200,000 miles of Virginia on it. I parked between a Mercedes and a Range Rover, and I sat there for a second and I almost laughed. I'd worn the nicest thing I owned that wasn't a uniform, a dark green dress, simple, and a pair of my mother's old pearl earrings she'd given me once and probably forgotten. No medals, no rank, nothing that said a word about who I was. I looked like exactly what my mother told everyone I was, a woman who ran a gas station dressed up for a nice dinner. I checked my own face in the rear view once, the way you check yourself before you walk a position you don't know yet, and I went in. I found my mother first at the door of the private room, working the crowd like she'd been training for it her whole life, which in a way she had. Cream-colored dress, new necklace, that bright social laugh she only ever used in front of people she wanted something from. She saw me and her face did a small, complicated thing. Not warmth, a kind of quick calculation. She hugged me. Fast, tight, the way you'd grip a railing on a set of icy stairs. "You came," she said. Then scanning my dress, my flat shoes, "You look comfortable." That word, comfortable. She'd used it on me before. It meant you didn't try hard enough, and now I have to manage that. "Hi, Mom. Now listen." She lowered her voice, her hand tight on my arm, steering me a few steps into a corner. "These are very important people. The Okafors are— You have no idea, Delia. The father was some kind of big deal in the service. So tonight, let's keep things simple, all right? If anyone asks what you do, you don't need to get into the whole gas station thing. Just say you're in business. Keep it light. This is Tessa's night. Let's not make it complicated. Keep it light. Don't make it complicated. In other words, disappear, so I can perform the family I wish I had. I'd been getting that instruction my whole life. And that night, God help me, I nodded. I actually nodded. Old habits. You learn to make yourself small in a family like mine the way you learn to walk into a cold lake, an inch at a time until you're numb enough not to feel it. Tessa found me a minute later and, to my surprise, hugged me with both arms. She was nervous, glowing, terrified, all at once. She looked beautiful. "Thanks for coming, Dee," she whispered. Then she pulled me toward a tall young man with a warm, open face and a good handshake. "This is Bennett. Bennett, my big sister, Delia." "The famous Delia," Bennett said, smiling, and it was a real smile. "Tessa says you basically raised her." "Somebody had to teach her to drive," I said, and he laughed. And for a second I thought, maybe this'll be fine. Then Bennett said, "You have to meet my parents," and he walked me toward the head of the table. And there he was, an older man, silver hair, quiet, straight-backed, standing to greet a cousin, his wife beside him, Grace, elegant, kind-eyed, in deep blue. Bennett said, "Dad, Mom, this is Tessa's sister Delia." The older man turned. He took my hand, warm, dry, a firm grip. "Ambrose Okafor," he said, "it's a pleasure." His wife smiled and said something lovely about how she'd heard I was the responsible one. And that was it. That was the whole moment. I didn't recognize him. Why would I? It had been 13 years, and back then he'd been in uniform with stars on his chest, and I'd been a terrified 31-year-old captain trying not to shake. Now he was just a gracious older man at his son's engagement dinner. His name landed on me and slid right off. I said, "Nice to meet you, sir." And I meant the "sir" the way you'd say it to anyone's dignified father, and I went and found my seat. They'd put me near the middle of the table. Not the head, not the far end, just the middle, between a cousin of Bennett's and an empty chair. I sat down, and the dinner began. For the first hour, it went the way these things go. Appetizers I couldn't pronounce. Toasts to the happy couple. My mother, 3 seats up in her absolute element, telling the Okafors and their relatives about Tessa. Tessa's job, Tessa's degree, Tessa's wonderful taste, Tessa's bright future. Every sentence a little brick in a monument to the daughter who'd followed the blueprint. And around all of it, that familiar rhythm. She'd introduce family members with their little titles. "This is my cousin Frank. He's an accountant. This is Bennett's aunt. She was a judge. Can you imagine?" Everyone got a rank, a reason to be respected. She skipped me. Not pointedly. Just the way you walk past a lamp you've had so long you don't see it anymore. Once, early on, Bennett's mother, Grace, tried to draw me in. She leaned down the table and asked warmly, "And Delia, Tessa tells me you're just wonderful with your hands. Did you get that from your father?" It was a kind question, a real one. And before I could answer, my mother jumped in. "Oh, Delia's very practical. she said, in a tone that somehow made practical sound like a consolation prize. Not everybody's cut out for the ambitious path, and that's just fine. And she smiled and moved the conversation somewhere else, and Grace's mouth tightened just slightly, and I saw Tessa look down at her plate. I let it go. I'd promised. It was Tessa's night. I ate my scallop and I made small talk with the cousin next to me, a nice young guy named Chidi who worked in Atlanta, and I kept my head down. But there was one person in that room who didn't have his head down, and that was General Okafor. I noticed it slowly. Every so often, from the head of the table, I'd feel it. A steady, quiet attention. I'd look up, and the general would be watching me. Not rudely. Not the way men sometimes watch women. He watched me the way you look at a word you know you've read somewhere before and can't place. A flicker of something behind his eyes, and then he'd look back at his plate. The first time, I thought I imagined it. The second time, I thought maybe I had something on my face. By the third time, I felt a small, strange prickle at the back of my neck, the kind you learn to trust when you've spent time in places where paying attention keeps people alive. His wife noticed him doing it. I saw her touch his arm once and murmur something, and he shook his head slightly, still studying me. Let me stop here for just a second, because I think some of you already know exactly where you'd have been sitting at that table. Maybe you've been the one they skip, the one whose whole life gets folded into a single dismissive sentence while everyone nods. If that's landing somewhere real for you, do me a favor and hit subscribe right now, because what this old man is about to do in the next few minutes is the reason I finally started telling these stories out loud, and I promise you, you're going to want to see it land. All right, back to the table. The general asked me one question across the table in a low voice during a lull. "Marchetti," he said, "where's your family from originally?" "My father built a gas station up in Troutville, sir. We're local, grew up right here." He nodded slowly. "And you," he said, "what do you do?" And this is the moment. Because before I could answer, my mother's voice cut across the table, bright and quick, the way it always did when the conversation drifted somewhere she couldn't control. "Oh, don't mind Delia," she said, laughing her social laugh, patting the general's arm like they were old friends sharing a joke. "She pumps gas for a living, up at the little station. We don't really talk about it." And then, to soften it, to make it charming, she added the line she'd used on me for a decade. "We sort of gave up on that one a long time ago, but she's very handy." A few people chuckled. That polite, uncomfortable chuckle that fills a silence. My sister looked down at her plate. Bennett's smile went stiff. And I did what I always did. I reached for my water glass. Steady hand. I took a sip. I set it back down. I did not correct her. I had promised. It was Tessa's night. I was 44 years old, and I had led soldiers through gunfire, and I sat there and let my mother tell 60 strangers that my family had given up on me, and I said nothing. And that's when General Ambrose Okafor set down his fork. I want to slow this down because I've replayed it 1,000 times, and I want you to see it the way I saw it. He didn't do it fast. There was no drama in it, not at first. He was mid-bite, and he simply stopped. He laid his fork down. On the tablecloth, teens down, careful. He wiped the corner of his mouth with his napkin, folded it, and set it beside his plate. And the whole time he was looking at me, and his face had changed. The polite social warmth was gone. In its place was something still and certain and very, very old. The look of a man who has just placed the word he couldn't place. Then he pushed his chair back. The legs scraped on the wood floor, and in a room of 60 chattering people, that small sound turned heads. He stood up to his full height. And my mother, who was still mid-laugh, still holding her wine, still waiting for her little joke to land, looked up at him with a bright, expectant face, certain he was about to say something gracious about the couple. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of voice that has given orders on the worst mornings of people's lives, and a voice like that, when it drops low and certain, silences a room faster than a shout ever could. "Forgive me," he said, "but I have to correct the record at my own son's table." The room went quiet, real quiet. Forks down, glasses stopped halfway. "The woman you just described as someone you gave up on," the general said, still looking only at me, "is Colonel Delia Marchetti, United States Army National Guard." He paused, and I watched 13 years move across his face. And in the spring of 2011, in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, I stood in a dusty motor pool and pinned the Bronze Star with valor on that woman's chest, because she ran into fire that everyone else was running away from, and she pulled 2 of my soldiers out of a burning vehicle with her own hands, 2 men who went home to their families because of her. Nobody moved. I could hear the air conditioning. I could hear my own heart. "I have been sitting here for an hour," General Okafor said, and for the first time his voice caught, just slightly, "trying to remember where I knew your face, and I just did." And then he did the thing. He came to attention, an old man in a gray suit at a wedding dinner, spine straight, shoulders squared, and he brought his right hand up in a slow, deliberate salute, and he held it and he said, "Colonel, it's an honor." Now, I have to tell you something, so that the veterans watching this don't write to me. What he did was not regulation. By the book, a junior salutes a senior first, not the other way around, and I was junior to him by 3 stars, and you do not exchange salutes in civilian clothes at a dinner table. That's not how any of it works, and General Ambrose Okafor knew that better than any person in that room. He had forgotten more about military protocol than I will ever learn, which is exactly why it landed the way it did. He wasn't following a rule. He was breaking one, on purpose, in front of 60 people, to say a thing that no rule could say. He was telling that table, and he was telling me, that some kinds of respect don't wait for regulations. I have never in my life been more moved by a broken rule. I stood up. I didn't decide to. My body just did it, the way it's trained to. And I brought my hand up and returned his salute, clean and sharp, the way I'd return it to any senior officer on any field anywhere. And 2 old soldiers held a salute across a wedding dinner while the room forgot how to breathe. And somewhere to my left, I heard my mother's chair and a small broken sound, and I turned my head just enough to see her knees give out. She caught the back of a chair with one hand. Her wine glass was still in the other, tilting, red wine running over her knuckles, and she didn't feel it. Her mouth was open. No sound was coming out. And Tessa had gone absolutely white, staring at me like she'd never seen me before in her life, which I realized standing there she never really had. We dropped our salutes at the same time. General Okafor stepped around the table, and he took my hand in both of his, and he said, "Quiet now, just for the people close enough to hear. I've told the story of that day 100 times, Colonel. I never knew your name had ended up back here. 20 minutes from my son, small world." He smiled and his eyes were wet. "Come, sit up here, by me." I want to tell you what that day in 2011 actually was, because the general only gave the room the short version, and you've come this far with me. It was April. I was 31, a captain, commanding a company, deployed with my guard unit. We were running a convoy on a road outside a forward base when the lead vehicle hit a buried IED. The blast flipped it and it caught fire, and then the small arms fire started coming in from a tree line because that's how they did it. The bomb was the bait, and the ambush was the trap. 2 of my soldiers were pinned inside that burning vehicle, a specialist named Aaron Pruitt, 22 years old, and a private named Wesley Tran, 19. I don't remember deciding to get out of my vehicle. I've tried. There's no memory of a choice. There's just, I was out and I was running, and the world was very loud, and I got the door and I got Pruitt, and then I went back and I got Tran. And Reuben and the others were laying down fire, so I could, and somewhere in there I got burned across my left forearm and didn't notice until that night. I still have the scar. It's the one part of that day my body kept. Both of them lived. Pruitt owns a hardware store in Ohio now. Tran has 3 kids. They both still text me on the anniversary, every April. The same 2 words, still here. That's the thing my mother pumps gas for a living was sitting on top of. That's what she'd given up on. General Okafor, back then a lieutenant general, was the one who reviewed the citation and flew out to present the award. That's the only time I ever met him. One afternoon 13 years ago in a motor pool for about 10 minutes. He read the citation aloud, he pinned the medal, he shook my hand, and he told me, I remember it exactly. The Army has a lot of people who wear the uniform. It has very few who are the uniform. Don't forget which one you are." And then he got back on a helicopter, and I never saw him again until he was cutting into a piece of trout at his son's engagement dinner and heard my mother tell the room I was nothing. The rest of the night, I barely remember the food. They moved me up to the head of the table. Grace Okafor held my hand and asked me real questions and listened to the answers. Bennett kept looking at me with a kind of stunned respect, and he said more than once, "Tessa, you didn't tell me. Why didn't you tell me?" And Tessa didn't have an answer, because the answer was that she'd spent her whole life being taught not to know. My mother tried to recover. Of course she did. 30 years of controlling every room she walked into doesn't die in one evening. Once the shock wore off her face, she reassembled it into delight. She came around the table and put her hand on my shoulder, the same shoulder she'd steered into a corner an hour earlier. And she said, warm and bright, for the benefit of everyone listening, "Well, we are just so proud of her. Delia's always been so modest about her service. She never tells us anything. She never tells us anything." As if the silence had been mine. As if she hadn't spent 22 years making sure that the second I opened my mouth about my work, she'd change the subject to Tessa's grades. As if she hadn't skipped my commissioning for a thing. I looked at my mother's hand on my shoulder, and I looked at her face arranged into pride, and something in me that had been holding its breath for a very long time simply let it out. I didn't make a scene. I want you to know that. The general had already said everything that needed saying, and he'd said it better than I ever could. I didn't need to twist the knife, but I did, quietly, so only she could hear, say one thing to my mother. I put my hand over hers, on my shoulder, and I leaned in like we were sharing a warm mother-daughter moment, and I said, "You didn't give up on me, Mom. You just never once looked. There's a difference. And everyone at this table just watched you find that out." Her hand went still under mine, and for the first time in my entire life, my mother had nothing to say. Later, near the coat check, when the dinner was breaking up, Tessa found me. She was crying. Real tears, not our mother's kind. Our mother cries with perfect timing and dry eyes. Tessa cried the ugly, honest way, mascara going, voice catching. "I didn't know," she said. "Dee, I swear to God I didn't know. About any of it. The medal, you never told me." And here's the thing I'd figured out somewhere in the middle of that dinner. "When's the last time you asked me, Tess?" I said. Not cruel, just true. Not, texted me about Mom's birthday, asked me, about my life. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Nothing came out because we both already knew the answer. "I'm not angry at you," I told her, and I meant it. "You were a kid. She raised you to see me the way she saw me. That's not your fault." I paused. "But you're not a kid anymore, and now you know. What you do with that is up to you." She didn't defend our mother. She just nodded, wiped her face, and hugged me, harder than she had in years. And in a family like ours, silence against our mother was its own kind of rebellion. It was the closest thing to an apology Tessa had in her yet. I decided it was enough for one night. Here's how it settled in the weeks after, because I know you want to know. General Okafor and I have talked twice since. He called the station, the actual gas station, and made me put him on the schedule for coffee. He's a good man. He asked me to come speak to a veterans group he chairs in Roanoke this winter, and I said yes. Grace sends me texts now, little ones, checking in. It turns out I gained more family that night than I've had in a decade, and none of them share my last name. Bennett and Tessa are still getting married, in the spring. Tessa asked me 2 weeks ago to stand up in the wedding. She's called me every Sunday since the dinner, just to talk. We're not fixed. You don't fix 12 years and a whole childhood in 3 weeks, but she's trying. She asks me questions now about my work, about our dad, about things she was never taught to be curious about. And I answer everyone, because the difference between my sister and my mother turned out to be simple. One of them was finally willing to look. My mother and I have not really spoken. She left me 2 voicemails. The first was about how I'd embarrassed her in front of the Okafors, how I'd made it about myself at Tessa's dinner. I deleted it. The second, a week later, was quieter. She said she'd been thinking. She said maybe she hadn't always understood my choices. That was as close to sorry as Corinne Marchetti has ever come, and I noticed it didn't contain the word sorry anywhere in it. I haven't called her back yet, not out of cruelty. I just don't have anything to say to her that a broken salute across a dinner table didn't already say better. Here's the last thing, and then I'll let you go. The Saturday after that dinner, I drove up to the little cemetery in Troutville, off Mill Creek Road, where my father is buried. And I sat down in the grass by his stone, and I told him the whole story. The trout, and the fork, and the old general standing up, and my mother's knees, and I told him what General Okafor said to me 13 years ago in that motor pool. The Army has a lot of people who wear the uniform, and very few who are it. And I told my dad that he was right. All those years ago, changing oil in the bay with a 9-year-old handing him wrenches. You are what you do when nobody's clapping. For 44 years, nobody clapped for me. Not my mother, not at that table, not once. And it turned out that was never the point. My soldiers went home. My father's station is still standing, his name still on the sign. 2 men text me still here every April. I know exactly what I did when nobody was watching. And a room full of strangers found out in one night what my own mother spent a lifetime refusing to see. The people worth impressing already understand what you are, and the ones who need a general to stand up before they'll look. They were never really looking at you anyway. So let me ask you just one thing before you go. When your family measured you, did they use the wrong ruler too? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story reached something real in you, leave a like so it finds the next person who needs it, and subscribe, because I tell one of these every week about the quiet ones who were the strongest people in the room the whole time. I'll see you at the next roll call.